Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday afternoon. It is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's time for another teissTalk. I'm your host, Jeff White. Apologies to those of you who are expecting my co-host, Jenny Radcliffe, is off and away at the moment, I think on an early holiday, and well-deserved too. So you've got me today and also on Thursday at 4 p.m. Just to alert you, we are normally Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 every week. However, we are taking the summer off. So after this week, we've got a few weeks off. But don't forget to diary us back in time for September, when we'll be back with, as usual, all of the key topics from the cybersecurity industry. Good afternoon. I hope you're all well. Nice to see our returning attendees. Nice to see those of you who are joining us for the first time. Welcome. Do help spread the word. We've got all of the topics covered on teissTalk. We're getting around every one of the big hitters. So please join us. And also, we're a friendly bunch. We like to see you here. So a couple of changes that I need to let you know about. Obviously, this week I am wearing the American football presenter's headset. Basically, my partner's nicked off with my other headphones, so I'm resorting to these. It does mean, however, that when the teissTalk music came on, I experienced a whole new level of bass. I had no idea that the thing was such a thumping tune. Maybe you did. And also, as ever, we have teissTalk mugs to give away, or a teissTalk mug to give away. Although I have some news that I need to share with you about the teissTalk mug. There does seem to be some kind of production flaw with the teissTalk mug. You can't see it, but there's basically a sort of T-shaped stain emerging around here, particularly worryingly emphasized around the bits where the handle joins the actual mug. So basically, I don't know, maybe it's just mine. Look, we're not going to issue a product recall for those of you who've already won the teissTalk mug, which I think is probably most of our viewers by now. But look, all I'm saying is if something goes wrong, don't sue us. We're just not liable for this at all. If the handle breaks, you spill hot tea on your computer, you lose your entire Bitcoin investment. No, we're not liable for that. Something is absolutely totally clear. I'm a bit worried now about the quality, obviously, of the teissTalk products. Whether the screen behind me is just going to fall over midway through the session today. But anyway, I'm sure it'll be fine. And well done, by the way, to our mug winners who've won mugs in the past. We're going to be talking on today's session about something that just kept coming up in the sessions again and again and again. So I'm really glad that we're focusing specifically on it in this session. It's a really interesting topic. It is third-party risk assessments, cyber regulation implications for supply chain security. So this just keeps bubbling away. The SolarWinds attack, the Microsoft attack, the Kaseya attack, which we'll be talking about in this session. How do you navigate your way around these things? How do you contract your way around these things? How do you escape liability or pass liability on to somebody else? So it's just a fascinating topic. And as I say, I'm really glad that we're getting in touch with that topic, being told by the Tice Elf, who, by the way, beavers away behind the screens to bring us some important bits of information, not to touch the screen. I'm touching the screen. It's physical. If you have questions, by the way, for panelists, do please put them in the chat tab. We've got a great set of people to talk about this. And by the way, if you're sort of after, frankly, free consultancy on how all this stuff works, now is the time. If you've got questions, please do ask them. We're going to be hearing later on from T. Patel, who's virtual CISO for Iron Oak Security. We also have Michaela Leovorg, who's information governance and cybersecurity consultant at Cybility Consulting Limited. But I want to welcome first our first guest on this, who is Andy Watkin-Child, who's founding partner of CMMC Europe, who's going to be chatting to us about himself, about this topic, and also about some of the news reports that we've been seeing around third-party risk. I'll be welcoming Andy as soon as his webcam boots up from wherever he's joining us from. There he is, large and in charge. Hello, Andy. How are you doing?
Hi, Jeff. How are you? Thanks for inviting me along.
Not
looking forward to the session.
Good to see you. Good to see you. And listen, for those who don't know, what is CMMC Europe? What does it do?
CMMC Europe, we're a consultancy. We're part of another company called Paravar Cybersecurity Solutions. We have been working with the United States Department of Defense CMMC accreditation body program, bringing that over here into Europe to support the UK defence industry. We're doing work with the UK defence industry and trade associations, supporting UK government, and more recently feeding back into the US. We've got a training business over in the US, which is supporting our US colleagues get up to speed with cybersecurity and CMMC. And we're doing more work now with Congress and other federal departments in helping them understand cybersecurity and doing a little bit of thought leadership over there.
Really interesting stuff. Thanks for that, Andy. By the way, somebody's commented that if the screen falls down, do we see the Tice elf pedaling away behind us? No, is the answer. Something much worse. Andy, just on that subject, it interests me this because I would have thought that given our long-standing relationship, our Five Eyes relationship between the US and the UK, particularly on defence, would have sort of thought we'd have already been. It strikes me that these. I would have thought these relationships would already be well entrenched, and British businesses would already know and have conduits into the US defence market and arena. But that sounds like it's not the case. It sounds like they need a bit more help than that.
No, not really. The challenge the United States has faced over the last sort of 5 or 10 years, certainly in relation to cyber, is that it's set expectations on its third-party suppliers, and it's regulated for those. Unfortunately, the third-party suppliers have not really been as forthcoming as in terms of implementing that as the DoD would have liked to have happened. And over the last sort of 2 years, a number of assessments have been done by the Senate and federal government, the Government Accountability Office in the US, which has clearly identified a significant failure of third-party suppliers to implement cybersecurity on behalf of the DoD. And CMMC is the answer to that as far as the DoD is concerned at this moment in time.
Right. So that's interesting. So the relationships are there, but there's concerns on the part of the US government around the cybersecurity posture of some of the third-party suppliers that are supplying US government. Is that?
Yeah, very much so. And the whole concept of CMMC is to regulate that. I often say CMMC is probably the world's largest cybersecurity program that nobody's ever heard of. The DoD has financial commitments of about $1.8 trillion US to make weapon systems, all sorts of weapon systems. It spends around $600 billion a year on the design, manufacture, and procurement of those weapon systems, and it relies on an international supply chain to do that. But it's been certainly, over the last sort of 2, 3, 4 years, the tensions between Russia, China, and the US, and the fact that a lot of intellectual property has appeared in other nation states, has raised a lot of concerns in the Senate and the House of Representatives, which is pushing through a hell of a lot of cyber regulation at the moment. We're going to see a significant spike in cyber regulation over the next 3, 6, 12 months, which will pass its way globally.
I was going to ask about that because obviously we've had the change of administration in the US, and I'm interested in how that's affected things because obviously the Trump administration, very much America first, trying to get American industry started, and also very skeptical of, well, particularly of China, less so maybe of Russia. How did the Trump administration sort of change the needle on that in terms of cooperation with UK partners, for example?
So I'm not a military person, so I really can't answer the question around the relationship between at a government level. But if we just talk the corporate side, under Trump, CMMC was developed. It came through under the Trump presidency. It actually started way back in 2017, where certain procurement regulation was embedded into Department of Defense procurement that passed out globally. As he moved on, and then Biden's come in, Biden unfortunately inherited a lot of cyber issues. Obviously, we had the SolarWinds, which you've touched on. We've had the Kaseya, and we've had the Colonial Pipeline, and we've had the JBS or JSB meat hacking incident. It's really brought cyber to the fore on a geopolitical level, across a geopolitical stage. Historically, cyber's been very much, a little bit of a hack here, a little bit of a hack there. But the hacks more recently have had a significant impact on the US economy. And I think under Biden, they have and they are seriously looking at that and taking that into consideration.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean the JBS, the meat hack. I love the phrase. In fact, we've now got the phrase meat hack in common parlance. The meat hack, Colonial Pipeline, and obviously SolarWinds. Probably used this gag before, but when you're hitting Americans, if you're hitting their oil supply and their burger supply and their government, then that's going to take them pretty seriously. Let's look at one of those. Look at one of those hacks then, because we're going to, the news story we're picking up on this week that we want to discuss is the Kaseya, obviously leading on from the Kaseya hack, but the development that we've had in terms of the key. So obviously, the Kaseya, most people will know this who've attended, but Kaseya was hit with ransomware, which obviously went out to the clients that Kaseya's software supports and to the clients that they then support. And there's now apparently a decryption key has been given over to Kaseya to decrypt all of this stuff. So, Andy, problem solved, right? We're in the clear, right of the woods.
Well, no, to be honest. I mean, I think we have to look at the evolution of cyber then, and how we get up to Kaseya. If we looked 10 years ago where cyber was just a, once in a 100-year event, what we call an extreme loss, it's now becoming very much an everyday occurrence. And why is that? Because the cyber community and the hacking community evolves, it develops. Everybody was working at home. Hackers went after people at home. The number of hacks on federal government and governments in general dropped off. With the Kaseya hack, it's very worrying because with Kaseya and also SolarWinds, hackers are now looking at a different way to target organizations and broader communities in society. And what better way to do it to go back to a source code and a product, impact that product, attack that product, book your code within that product and get that pushed out for you. And then what you can do as a hacker is you can sit back and see where your code has gone, and then you can directly influence and hack an organization because you've built in the trapdoors and the open doors in the case of Kaseya to get into organizations. So you've created the mechanism for deploying the ransomware, and you've got somebody else to distribute it for you. So for me, it's an evolution. It's just the next step on to the next thing, and it also demonstrates how the hacking community evolves. It's an evolution.
It's interesting as well in this case because obviously you've got, as you've described, by hacking a supplier of software to lots of people, your ransomware gets onto lots of victims' machines. And obviously what that does as a ransomware provider is gives you leverage to say, look, if I give you one key for the whole lot, you have to pay everybody's ransoms. We don't know in this case, I think it's true to say, whether Kaseya paid a ransom. There's something in their official, I'll get their official comment up in the chat, which says we've acquired it through a third party, which I found quite interesting, which raises this whole idea, doesn't it, Andy, of using brokers. I'm not sure whether this has happened in this case, but using brokers to pay a ransom for you and that being the way forward.
Yes, it does. And again, I think the challenge with where hacking is now moving to in terms of the broker type relationship is that it is going against what, for example, in the UK, paying a ransomware is considered illegal. I think it's considered illegal in the US because of the fact that you're paying effectively. You don't know where the money's going. You don't know whether it's obviously fraud. You're paying to resolve a fraud. You could be paying money into terrorism and child prostitution and a lot of other nasty. There's a lot of other nasty people, which brings in some ethical dilemmas for organisations. It also brings into question the level of security organisations are applying themselves, and hence why I think in the US the regulatory regime is gonna step up in a very big way, not only in terms of federal government, but also if we look at what the Securities and Exchange Commission are now planning. They are planning cyber. Well, they've been given the go ahead now through regulation to implement something called ESG regulation, which will then include cyber regulation. So all of these types of attack, and the fact that people are being paid money, and probably substantial amounts of money, if it is true, is exacerbating the problem, which puts organizations and governments and us in society in a very difficult place, because it just perpetuates. And how do we stop it?
Yeah, indeed. And the other issue, I mean, this is pointed out in the Threat Post article that our teissTalk posted that we picked up on. There's also this issue that even because ransomware groups are no longer necessarily just doing ransomware, and increasingly they'll steal data and use that as extra extortion, there's this question mark around the extent to which through Kaseya they could have actually exfiltrated information, and regardless of whether you get your computers unlocked from the ransomware, whether some of your organization's information has leaked out through the Kaseya software. I don't know whether that's something that you've picked up on, you got thoughts on.
Well, I think if you go back to the good old Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, people won't hack you just to necessarily ransomware you. They'll hack you to exploit you, and we all know that hackers can be inside an organization for a significant amount of time. Now, that may not have been the case with Kaseya. Nobody knows, because it was, it was a patch that was deployed, and then the hack started to take place. An interesting part of that, by the way, is those that have been compromised but may not have deployed the patch could still well be compromised. But we do know that hackers will remain inside an organization, and who wouldn't want to take the data first, then ransomware you, then threaten you to get payment. You won't know. Because the very fact that you've been ransomwared and your data's been encrypted, and the hackers are very good at cleaning up as they go in and as they come out, you may not know what has been lost. And that creates a problem for all of us.
And it does create also, in terms of the context we're talking about the third parties, you're no longer just dealing with a situation where your third party supplier has been compromised and you've been hit with ransomware. You're potentially dealing with a situation where your third party has been compromised and data from inside your organization has been taken by hackers through that third party. And it's bad enough trying to sort out the third party ransomware sort of issue, but if a year down the line data from your company emerges, how do you go about proving, well, actually that leaked data from our company actually came from this breach over here, which became from that third party over there? It's quite a gnarly one, I think.
It is, and if we just flip back to the Department of Defense CMMC program, by way of example, their biggest concern is in their supply chain. In their supply chains, a prime contractor in the United States could be going through 7, 8, 9, 10 layers of supply chain. If one of those suppliers gets attacked and that data gets stolen, is that weapon system compromised? So is that F-35 compromised? Is that tank compromised? Is that ship compromised? Because there's been a loss of data in the supply chain. And all you have to do is look at the aircraft that, the most recent tactical fighter in China. It looks very similar to an F-35. And that's not by accident or design. That's because there is a very strong belief that information has been stolen from within the supply chain. And they are commercial organizations. So, in that context, commercial organizations are involved in a supply chain that are making weapon systems for the protection of national security. So that's become a very serious issue in the US, and hence driving regulation. I was
going to say, it's I don't know if there's a quick answer to this or a simple answer to this, but I've always been intrigued by that. How many hops down the chain do you go? And as you say, you could have 6 or 7 more suppliers. Does the CMMC give any guidance as to how far down they will go or have to go for that? Probably not a hard number, but I'm just interested.
Well, the CMMC as it stands at the moment is going through a revision. Obviously, the Biden administration has come in. It went through a regulatory process to roll out an interim final ruling in November last year. There is an expectation that that's going to start to firm up again in September, October, when everybody comes back from the summer break. The original proposal was based on a data classification. It was if the Department of Defense felt that that weapon system was a CMMC level 3, everybody in the supply chain for that particular weapon system would have to adhere to a CMMC level 3, and they would have to undergo a separate audit by a third-party assessor. And if you did not pass that and you did not have a certificate of compliance, you would not be allowed to supply the DoD. So that's a fundamental shift in cyber regulation. It's if you do not comply, we will not buy.
Yeah. Interesting, really interesting this. And I want to bring in our other panelists on this because lots to discuss on that. So we have, as I said earlier, we've got T. Patel, who's Virtual Chief Information Security Officer at Iron Oak Security. And we also have Michaela Leovorg, who's Information Governance and Cybersecurity Consultant for Cybility Consulting Limited. Their LinkedIn profiles will be appearing as if by magic, or in fact by the Tice Elf in the chat window. So do feel free to look them up on LinkedIn. Hello, T and Michaela. How are you guys?
Hey guys, how you doing?
Hello.
Good.
Great to be here.
Good. Can I come to you first, Michaela? Just in terms of Cybility Consulting, how long has it been up and running? What's your sort of specialism?
Actually, not very long. I've branched out and gone out on my own only a few months ago after spending most of my time working in end user organisations. My specialism is really around the governance, risk and compliance piece. And in my last organisation in particular, which was an end of life healthcare charity, did quite a lot around supplier assurance, which is why I'm very interested in this space in terms of particularly how it affects smaller organisations.
Indeed, interesting stuff. And by the way, I like ferreting through people's CVs and just seeing. You did line. There was a line dancing thing you did. This was ages and ages ago. I just wondered, did you get your start in line dancing?
Wow, you really have been ferreting to find that one out. Yeah, so that actually came about quite by accident. A friend just sort of dragged me along to a session, enjoyed it, and then the teacher asked me to join them running some sessions. And yeah, I did that for a few years, ran some sessions at uni. It's great fun.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, it's good university activity because usually there's drinks and socialising afterwards. T, tell us also about Iron Oak Security and the role of the virtual. I don't think I've had a virtual CISO on yet on one of my programs. How's that going?
Yeah, so that's going well. So basically, virtual CISO is basically a CISO, which is working for multiple companies. Where a lot of companies do not have the need to have a dedicated permanent CISO on board. Where I will come in as a virtual CISO and actually advise boards on cybersecurity, its strategy, and actually maturity from a compliance perspective. So,
yeah. Good stuff. Yes, I know. As a vital role, I think, for a lot of organisations. But as I say, not a role that I've had on the show. So it's good to have you here, T. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And let's just pick up on before we've got some questions coming in, which is good. If you've got questions, by the way, for our panel, do ask them because these folks know a lot and can be very useful to you if you've got queries. But I just want to pick up on this Kaseya example. I mean, Michaela, what do you make it? I mean, as I say to Andy, I was putting this question that once the ransom's paid, it seemed like a big relief to Kaseya, but it presumably doesn't stop there for the victims of this, does it?
No, absolutely. I think it's very difficult, particularly where a lot of smaller organisations rely on their managed service providers actually providing a good level of security for them so that they don't have to worry about that because, somebody with more expertise and time knows about it. And to find yourself in a situation where actually you've been breached as a result of something down that chain, I think is very difficult and worrying for organisations, again, especially small and medium. So trying to ensure that your network hasn't been compromised directly and clear everything out, it's the expense and productivity loss of time that a lot of people really struggle with. So yes, it's definitely not over just because the decryptor key is there.
Yeah. And T, I mean, if you were sort of advising one of your clients about this, what I'm interested in is obviously Kaseya, are doing a good job. They're reaching out to their customers, they're blogging about this and so on. But there is this issue now of, the kind of support that you're getting from Kaseya and the risk of, I know there's already been spam emails and phishing emails going out to organizations saying, hey, here's the decryptor key and, you download it and you're virused. I mean, T, how would you be advising people who are looking at this, who would have been customers of Kaseya or end users rather of Kaseya?
Yeah, that's a good, from recent events. A lot of my clients don't use Kaseya at the moment, but they have been exposed on the SolarWinds aspect. Right. So I think the first thing that we actually advise them is basically looking at the exposure. Okay, we're using Kaseya or whatever solution, SolarWinds. Are we exposed? What is the versioning? What is the, what are the systems that are being used to get monitored? But more on the third party risk assurance is basically looking into the impact to the business and what the risk is. So that's the first thing that I'll actually advise that to look at, obviously, the lay of the land in terms of the hack. So if it was a ransomware attack, as Andy mentioned, we can never, be 100% certain, but definitely as hackers will go about is try to exfiltrate that data. So you'll always have that, set the expectation to the senior management, senior board, in interested parties that there could be potentially data loss or exploitation of data, but then the other thing is also the exposure of the system and how critical it is to the business and organization, and what is alternative and what is our decision to go forward to minimize, reduce, or mitigate that risk.
Yeah. It's interesting. I want to just to our whole panel. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I'm just interested in this aspect of to what extent do we know? We know that through the Kaseya software, ransomware was deployed. That's it's a sort of established fact. What I'm not clear on is whether data could have been taken out of one of the end users of the MSPs who were using Kaseya's stuff. Do you see what I mean? The sort of third link. Do we know whether information and data could have been taken out of an organization in the same way that ransomware was put into the organization?
I think we have to assume that yes, it was. You can't assume anything else. Regulators will expect you to be reporting to them first of all that you've had an incident, and they will ask, have you had data loss? If you assume that you haven't, and then that data appears and it appears to come from your organization, then they will obviously ask questions. Now your legal counsel, your general counsel will help you have that conversation appropriately. But it's never a good idea to assume that you haven't.
Oh, interesting. So I just want to pick up. We had a good question come in, which I think was from Scott. Scott Wilson's asked. I think this was following up on the conversations that Andy and I were having about the CMMC. And Michaela, I wonder if I could ask you about this. In the UK/EU, are we expecting to see something similar in terms of supply chain and not necessarily defence in this case, but more widely?
Yeah, so I think that Andy can probably speak to this more thoroughly than myself, but in my experience, prior to Brexit at any rate, what was happening in Europe did filter down into our regulatory frameworks. So, for example, if you take the NHS Data Security Protection Toolkit, when we had GDPR and NIS come through, the requirements from those were actually embedded into that data security framework. So it's sort of filtering down, and that did include, by the way, supplier assurance as part of that as well. Right. And we saw over in the US with the NIST cybersecurity framework and their latest version, they added aspects for supplier assurance as well. So I think we can assume yes. Whether it actually goes into regulation, I think I'll throw that one back over to Andy.
To answer the question, the answer is yes, and it's already here. The ESG regulation that was signed off by the Securities and Exchange Commission back in May, it regulatorily mandates organisations to report their material risks if you're a publicly traded firm to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And that impacts European companies. And the EU is progressing its own ESG regulation, as is China. And parallel to that, the SEC are currently passing through cyber risk governance regulation, which we all believe will end up in ESG, which will then enforce cybersecurity reporting on publicly traded firms in the US. Also, if you saw this morning, there was a great article published by Standards & Poor's. So Standards & Poor's are actively, and have been for some time along with Moody's, looking at the oversight of publicly traded firms globally around cyber, which has a direct impact on credit scoring and the financials of companies. So yes, in short.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that about Standards & Poor's and the credit rating agencies. But that does make a lot of sense, doesn't it? Your resilience to cyber attacks is part of your company's. Well, that will actually affect your when you fall victim to these. It will affect the value of your company. So it does make sense, I suppose. That.
And if you look at what Moody's did with Equifax, I think last year or the year before, they downgraded Equifax based on cash flow. So there was a real concern following the cyber attack in 2017 that their cash flow was going to be impacted because they had to find an extra $1 billion to fix the problem. So it's a natural progression. Yeah,
and actually, yes, you could go back to the Yahoo Verizon example, couldn't you, as well, in terms of what happened with the valuation when Verizon were going to take over Yahoo. Really interesting stuff. Folks, got some more questions coming through. Feel free to feel free to put in your questions. Here we go. It's an interesting one from Paul, going back to the ransomware example. Paul McCallum's asked, it's been asked to cover before, if we made ransomware payments illegal rather than tax deductible, would we see any change? I don't know what you think of that, T. Would you be in favour of that ransomware? I think to a certain extent there is.
Yeah, I would be in favour of making it legal, because I think we shouldn't pay it, because it just gives them more ammunition. I have come across two clients that did pay the ransomware, but the keys were basically didn't work. So it's not a guaranteed method. So I would always err on the side of not paying the ransom and making sure that you focus on your recovery and strategies. So your disaster recovery backups or strategies. So I think that's the key important thing. And I've seen a lot of reviews and a lot of recommendations to outlaw it. But I think it's a good strong move from my perspective.
Interesting. Okay, thanks for the question, Paul. Appreciate that. Any other questions, do stick them in the Q&A window up there. It's interesting, Michaela, I want to come back to you on this because you mentioned the NHS toolkit there, which is a link there too. Obviously, Andy's also mentioned sort of financial sector, SEC type, ratings agencies type stuff. To what extent at the moment is this about industry sectors? If you're in the NHS, this is your guidance. If you're in, financial matters, this is your guidance. To what extent is it a patchwork? Do you sense there's any kind of commonality between these different obligations regarding supply chain?
Yes, quite a question that. So as regards commonality in sectors, to a certain degree, I kind of just think security is security no matter what sector you work in. Criminals are criminals going after easy pickings, and if you happen to be an NHS trust, and you get done, then that's just how it is. In terms of the actual frameworks that different sectors have to comply with, whilst the specifics around the wording, the language might be tailored to that industry, fundamentally they're actually all quite similar. So there's some lots of good examples of the mappings between those different frameworks and the equivalence of those, so that if you actually do this list of controls in this framework, actually it maps across to, say, this in ISO 27001, which is this in NIST CSF. So there is a lot of overlap, but there's definitely some specifics around industries. So, for example, again, NHS, if you think about medical devices, this will be specifics around that wouldn't affect the financial sector.
Right, yeah. T, you've talked about this before. I know on LinkedIn you've bemoaned the different standards and so on. Regarding sort of third-party suppliers? Is it the same? Do you see the same patchwork effect, and you just have the same worries?
Yeah, and as Michaela mentioned, ultimately it's all baseline to security. We need to look at security holistically, regardless of sector. And the sad fact is we have so many frameworks and standards globally. Whether you work in NHS, you have the data security protection toolkit. Then you have in the manufacturing, you have teissTalk. Then you have IASME in the government space in UK. Then you have in DoD. You have so many different frameworks and your NIST guidance, ISO 27001, PCI DSS, the rest. But they're all covering the same elements, of security access control, encryption, secure development, secure configuration, etc. And the challenge, as in a lot of organizations, is we tend to see when you're actually reviewing and auditing third parties, you always ask them a security questionnaire. I've worked extensively in the financial sector where we've had extensive third-party security questionnaires by the banks and regulatory bodies where they come up with like 400 questionnaires on your risk posture. But the first question is, are you ISO 27001 certified? And if you are, then you don't have to fill out all those. Well, you still need to fill out all those controls, but then there's a pros and cons in different sectors. But I think the most important thing is how do we simplify it, and then how do you actually manage your third party effectively? Because we've had examples of third party service providers such as Microsoft, for example. They've got every certificate under the sun, but they were still targeted in a hack by the Chinese. So I think there's a balance. You need to understand that yes, there's so much that you can do in terms of providing assurance and reviewing the assurance of your third-party risk, but then there's also an element that you have to accept the fact that you will be hacked at some point in time.
Interesting. Michaela, can I come back to you? That there's did I see there's a DCMS attempt to try and tidy this up? Did I dream that? Did I make that up, or you're on mute, Michaela? I think there you go.
Sorry, there had to be somebody who did it, wasn't there? I'm not sure what the state of the outcome of their consultation is, but they're definitely doing some work around the supplier assurance piece in technology. There's one thing that if I might just have a little mini rant for a moment.
Be my guest.
I think when small and medium companies don't necessarily have the expertise or resources to do and complete these supply assurance questionnaires exactly as T's just mentioned, or even to sort of send them out and then evaluate the responses, I think there's personally, I think a responsibility for people like the Crown Commercial Service or other aspects in government to do those assessments on our behalf and create like a library of those sort of large suppliers, their information assurance documentation, so that smaller and medium organisations just go to that library, look at that and say, okay, well, they've done that assurance work, they understand what they're talking about, and then you'll feed that into their risk. Whereas at the moment, I feel, it's a bit haphazard. Anyway, I won't rant the whole time about it, but it's something that annoys me.
No, I think that sounds like an eminently sensible idea, and therefore one that will probably never see the light of day. But it'd just be interesting to see where that one goes. Sorry, T, go for it.
Yeah, I just want to add on to Michaela's. I mean, that's a very good example, because you look at the NHS, with the COVID pandemic over the last year, all of a sudden you have small little businesses popping up all over the place doing PCR tests or COVID tests. And we know in the NHS, if you want to communicate or actually deal with the NHS, you have to be, compliant to their DSP, their Data Security and Protection Toolkit, and ISO 27001. And with there's a lot of these small companies, they don't have that resources and capability. So I think, there needs to be a fine balance, right?
I mean, just to come in on a couple of points that both Michaela and T have raised. So if we talk about standards, one of the big concerns, there's two concerns we have on standards. One, US is setting standards and they are being pushed out. That is happening, and that will impact globally by the very fact if you want to trade with the US, if you don't comply, they won't buy. So we have a choice in the UK to make. The second one is UK cyber standards. That we don't have the UK does not have a cyber defensive strategy. We do a lot of talking about offensive, but we often talk about the cyber Maginot line. Once you break around the cyber Maginot line, everybody's fair game for a hacker. And what is the UK policy for setting the defensive cyber strategy? There isn't one. And to play to the small business point, there's a very good video that was of the Senate Small Business Committee last week online that looks at, and it's the US Senate now asking questions on how will the US address cybersecurity for small business. And we're currently writing a paper to support that in the US because it's a very difficult question, as Michaela's already said. If you are a small business, you cannot implement 110 cybersecurity practices because you can't afford it. You may not be able to afford the cyber insurance, and the cyber insurance industry's got its own issues at the moment. It cannot write policies. It's having problems with claims because of ransomware. And then you have cyber regulation coming down the line on top of all that. So there's a lot of concerns being raised in the US about how do you support small business managed cyber. And there are no easy answers.
And it's interesting in that it's those small businesses who are going to be reliant on the bigger players who say, "Look, we've got the software to help you out because you can't afford to do it, to do it yourself." It's chicken. It's a catch-22.
There's a more fundamental challenge actually that when you look at the statistics, small businesses make up 99.9% of all businesses in the United States. So, if you are the 5-man band, 5-woman band, 5-person band, and you're making those critical components for a nuclear reactor, you are a small business. If you get hacked and that data gets stolen, somebody has a problem. If you are the small business on the high street, coffee shop or the restaurant, and you get hacked, you have a problem. How do you afford to put in 110 practices? You can't. So how does anybody react? What's the process for supporting that? And that applies whether you're in the US, the UK, France, Germany, or wherever. Small business is an issue.
Michaela, can I pick something up with you as well? Because you mentioned this in our sort of pre-chat yesterday about the extent to which a lot of this is done as well on a sort of honesty box system where, you're sort of reliant on the suppliers to fill this stuff out and to fill it out correctly. Does that raise issues?
Yes. So... Okay, there's an issue around who completes the self-assessment questionnaire in the first place. Is it going to be done somebody in sales? Do they have their own team to do it? Is it somebody with the right expertise to actually understand the question in the first place? Some responses you get back, it's really clear that yes, they absolutely do. They're putting this stuff into practice because of the detail of the responses, and they actually answer the question that's there in terms of the criteria. Whereas there are others that will just sort of say, yes, comply, all the way down, no additional information about how they comply, and those you can genuinely sort of think, okay, they're just sort of saying this to get through the bit. But also, when you do actually mature as your cybersecurity program around supplier assurance, and you start to look at it as risk right through the life cycle, not just that initial procurement piece, but right through until you offboard them, then I've found some suppliers have been very uncomfortable with that, and as a result actually dropped out of tender bids because they didn't like that idea, which suggests that perhaps they weren't actually doing what they said they were. So yes, another bit of a pet peeve for me, but it's difficult because there aren't enough of us with the expertise to assess those responses. So if somebody comes back, say, with an ISO 27001 certificate that isn't UCAS accredited, then how are most people going to know and recognise actually that's not valid? All those sorts of issues. There's a lot around it, and I think as an industry, perhaps we could do more to work with procurement professional bodies to actually upskill them to help them as well.
Interesting stuff. T, can I ask you about that as well? I mean, Michaela's raised a good point there in the ongoing compliance procedure, because you could be, you get a supplier on board today, they look great, and then the next couple of days something goes wrong. What's your experience been like in terms of that, in terms of the ongoing checking of suppliers?
So a lot of my clients are quite varied. So I go from manufacturing to government to financial services. It all boils down to criticality to the business. So we need to find out, okay, who are the critical third-party suppliers and how important are they? I mean, one of my financial clients, they were exposed on the recent monetized saga, where they basically, one of the businesses actually got closed down, but then they had to find alternative means of payment transactions. So I think the recommendations that I've done in the past is basically, okay, look at the critical suppliers, find out what assurance they have, and then look at the contracts if we can do a right to audit maybe on site, depending on the criticality. But if it can't be done on site, then maybe remotely, but doing a proper evidential requirements gathering in terms of, okay, show me the evidence that you do A, B, C, for example. Yeah. But there's also the aspect on the risk-based approach of finding a balanced approach with small little suppliers. They may not have that, as Michaela mentioned, certain small suppliers may not have all that extension. And sometimes I think some of the things that I would do is actually recommend them, okay, you don't have these security controls. Here's a blueprint of basic security minimum requirements that I would like you to use in your organization. Please just work on it together to embed that into their business. And then once they are actually comfort, because I think there's an element of us, oh yeah, you need to do this, but I think there's a two-way relationship that we need to also help them to increase the maturity, especially when there's organizations that don't have that maturity.
Yeah. Interesting. Thanks for that, T. I'm coming to the end. It's closing a bit now. I just want to go back to Andy quickly on this point of sort of evidence, which T's touched on. Where are we now, and where do you see us going in terms of the amounts of proof that we have to come out with to sort of say, look, as Michaela said, look, yes, this ISO certificate is actually UCAS certified. What evidence base are we looking at, and where should we go?
As it stands at the moment, as I put my DoD hat on, they're expecting a certificate of cybersecurity compliance to be provided by an independent third party. Right. And those third parties at this moment in time can only be US citizens who've gone through a set training program. If you don't have the certificate, you won't be able to supply the DoD. That's one extreme side of it, but it's a direction of travel the DoD are currently following. One of the recommendations that we made into the US is that you need to have an annual assessment of your cybersecurity compliance completed by your accountant, because there's lots of accountants that can do that type of work. They need cyber training rather than audit training. but I think we're going to get to a point where the insurance industry is going to look at this, because the insurance industry is in a mess at the moment in terms of being able to underwrite policies and pay claims. One of the ways the insurance industry gets around it is it's to set a standard to say you must meet the following criteria. The same you do with your car insurance. I need an MOT, I need a tax certificate. Is it unreasonable to request that if you've got a balance sheet of a certain size, that you should have a number of cybersecurity practices in place? But that does open up the question then, what are those practices and how many and all that. So, but I think the regulatory direction of travel is being set now. We'll find out in the next 12 months, because what starts in the US ends up over here. And what choice does anybody have? It's a significant risk.
Yeah, interesting. Scott's put a comment in the chat. There must be zero future for cyber insurance, at least not one that ever pays out on a breach. Interesting. Maybe we need to get some insurers on to discuss that. Folks, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you for that. I'm aware we're sort of pressed for time, so I'll let our panelists go and say thank you to them. Andy Watkin-Child, founding partner at CMMC Europe, T. Patel, VCISO, Iron Oak Security, and of course, Michaela Leovorg, information governance and cybersecurity consultant at Cybility Consulting Limited. Folks, thank you for attending as well. We're back. I'm back on Thursday at 4. We're going to be talking sharing cyber risk and awareness, an integrated approach to cybersecurity. So how do you actually grow cybersecurity awareness outside of just the tech bits of the business? We have the fantastic Brian Brackenborough from Channel 4, who is a good chap if you haven't seen him before. So do tune in on Thursday at 4. Have a great rest of the day, though, and a great rest of the week. And we'll see you later on this week. Thanks again to our panelists. Thanks to our viewers. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.